He gave too much, but no one saw it as a problem. They called it a good man. A man who's always there. A man who always asks, "Are you okay?" Even though almost no one ever asked him that. They praised his patience, admired how he quietly carried everything without asking for anything, and called it being a man. So, he kept giving, day after day. No complaints, no pause. No one saw that. Every time he tried a little harder, a part of him quietly disappeared. At first, he still smiled, still poured coffee for others, still asked, still stayed, even when all he wanted was to leave. But then, one day, he stood in front of the mirror, same eyes, same familiar face. But he didn't recognize himself anymore. The man reflected in the mirror looked calm, but cold, looked strong, but tired, looked okay, but not real. And in that silence, a small question echoed, quietly, but more painful than any rejection. How long has it been since anyone asked him a simple question, "Are you okay?" He was always the one to initiate, the one who thought ahead, acted first, gave in first. He never waited to be asked to help, never kept track of how much he had given that day. To him, caring was a habit, not a tactic. Being proactive was his nature, not a calculation. And love was a quiet act, needing no spotlight or praise. He remembered every milestone in others' lives. He showed up, even when no one asked him to. He chose silence, just to keep others at peace. Half-hearted conversations, he still listened. Tense dinners, he still smiled, just to make things easier. People once called him a good man, said, "You're always so mature, so understanding." Ho, said, "I'm lucky to have someone like you." Ho. But then, those words of praise slowly faded, not because he changed, but because he'd always been this way too often, too steadily, too predictably. And things that repeat tend to be taken for granted. No more thank you, though, no more appreciative glances. His care now feels like air, when it's there. No one notices, when it's gone. Few even realize. He never said a word, because he never gave to be acknowledged. But he could feel it, the quiet inside him, starting to grow. Not from pain, but from disappointment, from feeling himself fading, in a world where kindness is treated like a free service, and when giving is no longer seen. That man didn't suddenly turn away or change. He just quietly gave a little less, not out of bitterness, but because he needed to keep something for himself. He was still there, but no longer moving forward like before. Because sometimes, what makes someone step back isn't that they've changed, it's that they've given too much, and no one stopped to ask, "What's left for you?" And that was the moment he began to disappear, even while standing among everyone else. There was no argument, no slamming doors, no accusations, no tears, just him and evenings that felt longer than usual. Just the silence between two people, growing wider. But no one said a word. He didn't walk away. He just gave less. Less calls, less texts, less checking in, less effort, less need to be the first. Not because he stopped caring, but because every attempt was met with silence. Like knocking on a door that never opens. He slowly withdrew. No noisy, no drama. Like a light that gradually dims. Not one that suddenly goes out. No one asked why he stopped showing up. No one wondered why he was so quiet. People just went on with life as if he'd never been the center of anything, and that was the deepest pain. He didn't leave anyone. He was just forgotten while still being there. The day he stopped texting goodnight, no one replied. The day he missed the gathering, no one asked, "Where is he?" Each small act of his disappeared, but no one noticed. Because what isn't appreciated is never missed. He once tried to hold on, but in the end, he understood. The more you hold on, the more it hurts. The more you try, the more out of place you feel. So he stopped trying, not to be remembered, not to be loved, but just to stop his heart from breaking one more time. He no longer tried to exist in places that made him feel invisible, no longer clung to relationships that needed one-sided effort to survive. And when he sat alone in the silence that once suffocated him, he suddenly realized something strange. The silence that once broke him was now the only thing that made sense. One Sunday morning, he woke up early, just like always. No message alerts, no one checking in, no thank you left from the day before. This silence used to make him feel empty, used to make him feel abandoned. But that morning, everything was strangely quiet. And instead of feeling hurt, he just felt relieved. No one was waiting for him. And there was no one he needed to wait for. He made coffee, unhurried, not for anyone, not to prepare for a shared morning. Cousin just simply made it and sat down on his own. He looked out at the balcony. The wind moved through the curtains. A bird landed on the power line, then flew away. Nothing big happened. But he knew he was beginning to walk away from an old way of living. Not with finality, not in rebellion, but in a quiet, intentional retreat. No more waiting for replies. No more checking the phone. No more asking himself, did I do something wrong? For the first time in many years, he didn't feel guilty for choosing to be alone. No more forcing himself to keep everything connected. He stopped holding on to others and started learning how to hold his own hand. Silence was no longer the enemy. It became a kind of raw peace, unpolished, but more real than anything ever promised. And that strangely made him breathe. Not an exhausted breath, but a deep one. As if for the first time in his life, the air in his lungs didn't carry anyone else's expectations. He didn't need a new beginning, didn't need to leave, or be led somewhere else. Because in that quiet morning, he realized what he was searching for was not somewhere else. He wasn't looking for a new life. He was looking for the man he had once lost. In the very life he already had, he started to clean up his life quietly, slowly. Without anyone knowing, he took off his headphones, no longer escaping into someone else's sound to fill the emptiness inside. He turned off the television, no longer needing background noise to pretend the room had life. He cooked for himself. Not fast food, not instant noodles, real meals, peeling an apple, making a pot of soup, setting the table properly. Even if there was only one seat, he ate slowly. No rush, no scrolling on the phone while chewing, no one to answer to mid-bite. He played an old song, a song he used to love before he forgot what he loved. And when the music played softly in the kitchen, he felt something stir inside, far away. Faint, but real. No one was there to witness that moment. No compliments, no emocional gaze, just him and his own presence. And for the first time, he lived without needing to be seen. No need to impress, no need to shine, just to be there. He no longer feared lonely weekends, no longer needed plans to fill the time. He cleaned his closet, rearranged the layout, wrote a few lines in a notebook, went running without wearing a watch. Everything moved slowly, but for the first time in years, none of it was done to please anyone else. He didn't need to be certified as okay. Oh, he just needed to know. He was living in a way that no longer drained him, and once he began to rebuild his life in silence, he also began to live by a new principle, a set of values that didn't need to be understood by anyone else, only needed to be kept by him. He started living by new principles, not ones he was taught, not ones he learned from books, but truths he took from the times he was drained, trying to hold on to what no longer belonged to him. If it exhausted him, it declined. If it confused him, he didn't chase it. If it asked him to betray himself, he walked away. No warning, no noisy, no explanation left behind. Now, he no longer needed to win every argument. He didn't need to be understood, didn't need others to agree for him to feel at peace, because he had grown too used to explaining his feelings to people who only wanted to hear what pleased them. He once tried, once justified, once begged for the bare minimum of recognition. Now, if someone didn't understand him, he let them keep that misunderstanding. He didn't build walls to isolate himself. He simply redrew his boundaries to protect the quiet he had paid for with pain. Those who were used to the version of him that was always available, always clearing the path, always taking the lead, would now say he changed. Yes, no, because now, he didn't reply to messages right away, didn't accept invitations just to avoid saying no, didn't rush into a relationship just to avoid feeling alone. He gave time to things that mattered, and stayed silent toward things that only created chaos inside him. No longer a background for others, no longer trying to shine just to be kept. He stopped forcing himself, and he didn't ask anyone's permission to live in a way that gave him peace. But when a man starts becoming harder to reach, the world around him starts assigning the wrong labels. They started talking about him differently, that he had become cold, that he was harder to understand than before, that there was something about him, distant, indifferent. They weren't used to a man who no longer nodded out of politeness, no longer said yes just to avoid upsetting others, no longer played the savior in dull conversations. They didn't understand why he no longer tried to connect like he used to, why he stayed silent at passive-aggressive remarks, why he could walk away without looking back. To them, it was change. To him, it was liberation. The truth is, they no longer had control over him. No one could make him feel guilty for not responding. No one could force him to reply, to show up, to please. He didn't need to be comforted, didn't need to be reassured to feel whole. He had learned how to stand without holding on to anyone. The man who once softened at every promise, now only nodded when he saw consistent action. The man who once gave his time to anyone in need, now gave his presence only to what truly deserved it. Not because he was arrogant, not because he was hurt, but because he had once been used by the very people who said they cared while holding the zipper in their hands. They feared him not because he was dangerous. They feared him because he was no longer driven by guilt. He couldn't be manipulated by silence, by half-kept promises, by unclear emotions. And when a man no longer needs acceptance to feel worthy, he becomes the one person no one can control. They said he was distant, but the truth is, for the first time in years, he had finally returned to himself. He no longer showed up at crowded parties, no longer took part in loud conversations full of jokes. He often walked alone, sipped coffee slowly, read old books, and kept his daily schedule open enough to listen to himself. People looked at him and thought, he's lonely, but they didn't know that the emptiness they feared the most was now a deliberate choice for him. Loneliness used to be his fear, the silence that made him feel invisible, the long evenings with no one asking if he'd eaten, the meals with the seat across from him always empty. He used to fear silence so much that he'd leave the television on even when not watching, reach out to someone just to feel like he still existed. But then one day, he stopped searching. He started hearing his own breath, started learning how to live without having to fill the space. Now, silence was no longer the result of being left behind. It was the result of a journey back to himself. He no longer needed someone next to him to feel worthy, because he had learned how to sit with himself without feeling lacking. No one could understand that the silence he lived in now was not an unspoken sadness, but a pride that needed no proof. He wasn't waiting for someone to come and fill the void, because now, within him, there was no more space left that needed to be replaced. If someone asked, "Aren't you afraid of living alone?" he would smile without defense, without avoidance, and softly reply, "I was, but only when I didn't know who I was." And because of that, if love ever returned, it would have to pass through a gate called peace. He still believes in love, but he no longer sees it as the final destination. If she comes bringing calm, respect, a soul that doesn't need to overdo things, to impress that would be beautiful. But if not, he remains himself. Because now, love is no longer something he needs to feel complete. It is no longer a condition for his existence. It is no longer a reason to sacrifice boundaries, trade time, or disrupt the peace in his mind. Love, to him now, is a reward, if it arrives at the right time, in the right way. From the right person, he is open to receiving it. If not, he won't go looking anymore, because this time, he won't trade his clarity, just for a fleeting feeling. He once naively believed that with enough patience and sincerity, someone would stay. But then he realized, some things cannot be held on to, no matter how much heart he gives. And some people were never meant to stay in the first place. Now, he doesn't need to read anyone's mind, doesn't wait on messages, doesn't wonder, am I doing enough? He no longer tries to impress, because if he has to strain to be loved, then it's no longer love, it's a role with an ending. He once lost himself trying to hold on to someone, and now he promises himself he won't let that happen again. If a woman comes, she won't need to fill any emptiness, she just needs to walk beside him, without disturbing the peace it took him so long to find again. He's not afraid to love again, he's only afraid of loving wrong again, and losing the most precious thing, the clarity within himself. This time, he doesn't choose a spark. He chooses peace that needs no explanation. And he knows this deeply. He will never let himself get lost again. Back then, he used to ask himself, what do I have to do to be loved? How much effort? How much compromise? How far must he bend himself for someone to stay? Now, he no longer asks that. Instead, he quietly tells himself, I must not lose myself again, just to hold on to someone. Because he has understood true love doesn't need to be proven, and peace cannot be bought with submission. He no longer needs anyone to feel whole. He has found completeness in his own silence. He once gave endlessly, just hoping to keep something from slipping away. But when he stopped, it wasn't because of pain, it was for survival. If you've ever quietly withdrawn, not because you were cold, but because you couldn't take it anymore, leave a soft comment. I'm not cold. I'm just enough. Zero.